sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. These are the words of Jesus recorded in Luke 4:18 through 19, the NRSV version for seminary. As I was thinking about the work and the life of Father Gustavo Gutierrez, I could not help but think of these words by Jesus to bring good news to the poor. On October 22nd, 2024, Father Gustavo Gutierrez went home to be with his liberator, but he didn't do it without leaving us some of the most important texts in recent church history, and I would argue in all of church history. Born in Lima, Peru, Gustavo Gutierrez became a priest in 1959. He originally set out to become a medical doctor and then taking a turn into theology. I know many of us also find ourselves suddenly changing our course and finding ourselves studying theology. In 1971, La Teología de la Liberación, a theology of liberation, was published, becoming a foundational text for liberation theologies, not just in Latin America, but all over the world. His preferential for the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized changed the way that we do theology today. I still remember the first time that I encountered the name of Gustavo Gutierrez. I was actually yesterday, we had this sweet moment in systematic theology where Dr. White let us kind of honor his memory, and I share a little bit of the story. But I remember being a 22-year-old kid, as a Black woman, as an immigrant to the United States, struggling with assimilation to whiteness in the white evangelical church. And it's in that context that I suddenly heard his name and the words liberation theology. Hearing his name, even seeing the word in Spanish in a very white-centric place where I was, that moment just like changed my life. Who is this person that somehow changed church history? It was almost like he was being kept a secret from me, you know? And so, of course, you know, this is like iPhone, what, 4? I looked him up and I pulled up his Wikipedia page. And I just couldn't believe that he was from Peru like me, and that I had never heard his name before. But the words liberation theology stuck to my soul. Liberation, this is what I was seeking, and that is what I couldn't find. That moment happened over 10 years ago now, and I still will never forget it. It is because of that moment, because of his words, that I'm still here. Not only here in the seminary, but here. Father Gutierrez believed in God's preferential option for the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. And not only that, but the poor have something to tell us about who God is. Our voices don't always make it to the academy, but we do have something to say about God. God demonstrates a special predilection toward those who have been excluded from the banquet of life, he says. And now that Father Gutierrez is an ancestor, and as we remember the man known as the father of liberation theology, though he would argue it's somebody else, I want us to ask ourselves, who is still excluded from the banquet of life? It is our turn to continue his legacy. It is our turn to bear witness and to remember in everything that we do that God is a God of liberation. Ashe.
I'm going to have some names read. I'm going to give you one, and I'm going to give you one of these.
We will be calling out names of the departed from this year who have been close to union. And we welcome all of your names also, please, to say them aloud once we are finished.
Dr. Thelma D. Adair.
Dr. Fred Lamar Allen.
The Reverend Dr. Levon Althouse.
Mr. Ivan A. Backer.
Mr. Horace N. Barker Jr.
Mrs. Constance Conklin Bell.
The Reverend Dr. Lawrence V. W. Black.
Mrs. Janet Weaver Blackburn.
The Reverend Susan A. Blaine.
The Reverend James Brewer Calvert.
Dr. Robert Faith Brown,
Dr. Eugene S. Butler.
the Reverend Dr. Gay Lynn Byron,
Dr. David S. Chen.
the Reverend Carl L. Cooper,
Professor Ruth Dillingham Cowan.
the Reverend Dr. David D. Daniels III,
Mrs. Beverly Corbett Davidson.
the Reverend Harold Dirksen,
Dr. David L. Ellison.
Dr. Allison R. Enser,
Dr. Quentin J. Faulkner.
Professor Richard A. Fensky,
Dr. Francis G. Fike.
Ms. Lydia Esther Fragosa,
Dr. Blake Timothy Franklin.
the Reverend Robert L. Glass,
Miss Kristen Eileen Guest.
the Reverend Melvin J. Hammer,
The Reverend Bryce Cameron Harris.
the Reverend David Allen Hart,
Dr. Charles Huddleston Heaton.
the Reverend David M. Henkelman,
The Reverend Norman A. Helm.
the Reverend Dr. Jane Elizabeth Huber,
The Reverend Shirley Margaret Lent Hubert.
Bishop Joseph C. Humper,
Dr. Clive Franklin Jacks, Jr.
the Reverend Edward C. Yeager,
Bishop Frederick C. James.
Mr. Michael J. Johnston,
The Reverend Robert Emerson Jones.
Father Tekena Hosua Joshua,
The Reverend Dr. Norman J. Cansfield.
Professor Michael A. Nibb,
The Reverend Kermit Martin Kruger.
Dr. J. Kenneth Kuntz,
The Reverend Thomas R. Laws.
Mr. James H. Lazenby,
Mr. Norman Lear.
Dr. Walter Lewis Liefeld,
Mrs. Lillian Lovelace.
Dr. Wallace Eugene March,
Mrs. Helen Shed Mathers.
the Reverend David B. McElhenney,
The Reverend James W. Muir.
the Reverend Donald R. Niswanger,
The Reverend Michael J. Payne.
Ms. Ellen Peekle,
The Reverend J. York Peeler Jr.
Mr. John M. Pratt,
The Reverend Dr. Stephen M. Price.
Mr. Joel Rankin,
The Reverend Dr. Robert W. Ray.
the Reverend Dr. Bruce Warren Robbins,
Mr. John W. Roberts.
the Reverend Dr. F. Peter Sabe,
Mrs. Julia Powers Sandercock.
the Reverend Robert G. Sandercock,
Dr. James A. Sanders.
Dr. Charles Spar Sangri,
The Reverend Dr. James A. Scher.
Dr. Ralph Clarence Schultz,
Mr. Russell Samuel Schultz.
Ronald Ray Scott,
Ms. Mary Lynn Servey.
Ms. Elizabeth S. Shackelford,
The Reverend Michael James Sheen.
Ms. Candace Simons,
Dr. Donald A. Smith.
the Reverend A. Eric Snyder,
Dr. Robert A. Spivey.
Mr. R. Beal Thomas Jr.,
The Reverend Louis W. Towler.
the Reverend Dr. Darla D. Turlington,
Dr. Halcott Mebane Turner.
Ms. Cynthia Lee Von Erfer,
Mr. Edward Vinson.
Mrs. Martha B. Vocal,
Ms. Catherine Lois Waldron.
Ms. Nancy Warren,
Mr. Harry Mitchell Watson Jr.
Professor James C. Wernham,
Mr. Stephen T. Whitney.
the Reverend Leonard C. Wybe,
Dr. J. G. Williams.
the Reverend M. Burns Willis,
Mrs. Abby Dittman Wise.
the Reverend Philip N. Yang. We now invite
Hold on.
your
I'm sorry. We have one more name for the union. Dr. Barbara G. Wheeler.
your memorializations of those who have passed.
Christine Noble,
Sambo Lawan Bapa,
David W. Jower, Rachel Graves
Anton
Jones,
Sputnik
Aaron
Sovitov.
Kerr, Joanne.
Aida
Lydia
Lopez, Aida Alana.
Nora Breen, Catherine Kaler, Yvonne McKenzie, Maria Breeny.
عبد اللطيف ربحي.
Keely Johnson, MD.
Iris Espada, Jose Rivera.
Tradition is to say presente when we name the people that have passed, which means here or present. So we will say our last and first person who a lot of us do have a lot of connection with is the Reverend Dr. Gustavo Gutierrez. And for all of the other names, we say presente.
We could take a second to sort of take that in, and then we can start on the stuff on the table. Okay, so we have stations here. Feel free to swap chairs. There is on this side some modeling clay if you want to make actual sugar skulls. I don't know how to do it, so figure it out, I guess. But that's where we could start. And then there's paint, and there's also some actual like drawings here that you can color in. And then on this side, we have to make flowers, poppies or any kind of flowers that we will end up bringing to the altar. So feel free to get creative. Yeah.
If you know how, you know. Okay. Yes, it's supposed to be. Oh, no. Yeah, that's what I'm supposed to. Yes. And set and side note. It's like that. Like I said, it's like a Venn diagram. The Venn diagram. Sophia, can you please bring me a copy from inside the? Yeah, real quick, please, so that we can see it. Can you please?
This is for thinking. Like this. Let me see it. Yes. That's what it is. I'll try it. Maybe it makes you fall down.
There, okay, so I will see exactly. Great. Yes, that's. What is it here? You want to make a copy? So we're trying, so this is to. Yes. So this is, yes, so this is the. So can you talk to me first?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dean Monte? Yeah, okay. You want to make the announcement? We're gonna have to go around to the. So you're welcome to come back here, but right now we're gonna go. Yeah. So if you're not, if you're like, you aren't ready, you can bring yourself later, because that's where everybody else is gonna come. Signature.
If you know how to get there,